whipped every night by her father until a Shawnee rider slashed through the rope to save her. The crack of the leather strap echoed through the log cabin like thunder on a summer night, each strike leaving fresh welts across Hannah Kimball's bare shoulders as she bit down on the worn cloth between her teeth to keep from screaming. Her father, Josiah Kimball, stood over her with eyes as cold as the Kentucky winter, his breathing heavy with exertion and something darker that Hannah had learned never to question, while her stepmother Constance watched from the doorway with a face carved from stone and a satisfaction that glittered in her pale blue eyes like frost on glass. "Hello, my dear friend. This is Marcus Thornwood, your narrator of Frontier Chronicles. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to know that what you're about to hear is a story of survival, transformation, and the unexpected places where hope can be found. I hope this tale moves you as much as it moved me to tell it. A big embrace to all of you, and may you find inspiration in Hannah's courage. At 17 years old, Hannah Kimball carried the weight of being unwanted like chains wrapped around her very soul. Her skin bore the crisscrossing scars of 5 years of nightly punishments. Her frame was thin from meals she was rarely permitted to finish, and her eyes held a wildness that came from knowing that each sunrise might be her last. In the remote stretches of Kentucky Territory in 1794, where settlements clung to the edges of vast forests like barnacles on a ship's hull, and where the tension between settlers and the Shawnee Nation created an atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion. Being the stepdaughter in a household that valued obedience above humanity was a sentence worse than death. The Kimball homestead sat along a narrow creek that fed into the Ohio River, surrounded by towering sycamores and black walnut trees, whose branches seemed to reach toward the sky like the arms of drowning men. The air always carried the scent of wood smoke, mixed with the earthy smell of the root cellar where Josiah stored his corn whiskey, the product he valued more than his own family. But for Hannah, this place that should have offered shelter was instead a daily gauntlet of cruelty, orchestrated by a man whose heart had turned to stone long before she entered his life. Your mother was a whore who died giving birth to a bastard like you. Josiah spat the words like venom as he coiled the leather strap and hung it on its hook beside the fireplace, a permanent reminder of what awaited Hannah each night when the sun went down. You'll never be worth the food you eat or the air you breathe. Best you learn now that your only purpose is to serve those better than you. The words fell on Hannah like physical blows, each one carving deeper into her sense of self until she sometimes wondered if Josiah might be right. If perhaps she truly was the worthless creature he claimed. Her younger half-siblings, Thomas and little Prudence, had learned to avoid her as if her misfortune might be contagious, keeping their distance and sometimes joining in the mockery when their parents encouraged it. It was as if the entire household had conspired to remind her that she existed only on borrowed time and stolen mercy. At night, when the whippoorwills called from the dark forest and the creek babbled over smooth stones worn down by centuries of water, Hannah would curl herself into the smallest possible shape on the dirt floor of the storage room where she slept, separated from the main cabin by a thin wall that did nothing to muffle the sounds of her family's laughter and conversation. But there were moments rare as shooting stars in a clouded sky, when Hannah felt something different stirring beneath the layers of shame and pain. When she hauled water from the creek in the early morning mist, when she scattered corn for the chickens in the yard, or when she caught glimpses of deer moving like ghosts through the forest edge. A voice whispered quietly in the depths of her being that perhaps there was more to existence than what Josiah Kimball's cruelty had defined for her. Perhaps somewhere beyond this clearing, beyond these trees, there was a world where she could simply breathe without apologizing for taking up space. The brutal Kentucky autumn brought with it a series of events that would shatter Hannah's world and remake it into something she could never have imagined. Tensions between the settlements and the Shawnee people had been escalating for months, with both sides suffering losses and grievances that seemed impossible to resolve. Josiah Kimball, like many settlers, saw the Shawnee as obstacles to be removed, savages who stood between white men and the prosperity they believed God had promised them. One evening in late October, as the maples blazed red and gold, and the air turned sharp with the promise of coming winter, a Shawnee hunting party passed within sight of the Kimball homestead. They were peaceful, moving quietly along the game trails that had been used by their people for generations, but Josiah saw their presence as a provocation. He gathered several men from neighboring farms, men whose hatred had been fermenting in corn whiskey and fear, and they set out to teach the Indians a lesson they wouldn't forget. Hannah learned of the attack 3 days later, when Josiah returned home with blood on his hands and a satisfaction in his eyes that made her stomach turn. He had killed a young Shawnee hunter, a man barely older than Hannah herself, and he boasted about it as if he had slain a dragon rather than murdered another human being. That night, Josiah's rage seemed to have multiplied rather than been satisfied by the killing. He took the leather strap down from its hook earlier than usual, and Hannah knew with a sick certainty that this beating would be worse than all the others. She was right. The first strike knocked her to her knees. The second drove the air from her lungs, and by the fifth she could no longer maintain her silence. Her screams echoed through the cabin and out into the night, carrying across the creek and into the forest, where sounds traveled in ways settlers never understood. "You'll learn your place tonight." Josiah growled as he raised the strap again, his face flushed red with exertion and whiskey, and something approaching ecstasy. "You'll learn what happens to those who don't show proper gratitude for the charity they've been given." But before the strap could fall again, before Hannah could brace herself for another strike, the cabin door exploded inward with a force that sent splinters flying across the room. A figure moved through the doorway with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, and in the firelight Hannah saw him clearly. A Shawnee warrior with long black hair bound with leather cord, wearing buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, his face painted with the stark lines of a man on a mission of justice. In his hand he carried a knife that gleamed like captured moonlight. The warrior's eyes swept the room in an instant, taking in Hannah's bloodied back, Josiah frozen, with the strap still raised, Constance backing toward the corner where she kept the rifle, and the two younger children huddled together in terror. Time seemed to stretch and bend, each second lasting an eternity as the warrior's gaze locked with Hannah's. And in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that transcended language and culture and all the barriers that supposedly divided their worlds. With a movement too fast for the eye to fully comprehend, the warrior closed the distance between himself and Josiah. The knife flashed once, twice, and the leather strap fell to the floor in two pieces, its power to harm suddenly and completely destroyed. Josiah stumbled backward, his courage evaporating like morning dew under the sun, his mouth opening and closing, but producing no sound beyond a strangled whimper. The warrior spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority despite the fact that he used words Hannah didn't understand. But she didn't need to understand the language to grasp his meaning. "This violence stops now. This cruelty ends tonight. This girl is under my protection." He pointed at Hannah and then at the door, his intention clear even without translation. Hannah's mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. This was a Shawnee warrior, one of the people her father had taught her to fear as savage killers who showed no mercy to white captives. Everything she had been told suggested that going with him meant a fate worse than death, torture and degradation and eventual murder when they tired of tormenting her. But as she looked at the man standing before her, his knife still held ready, but his eyes showing no cruelty, only a fierce determination to prevent further harm, and then looked back at Josiah cowering against the wall, Hannah realized something profound. She was already living a fate worse than death, and whatever waited for her beyond that shattered door could not possibly be worse than what she would endure if she stayed. The warrior extended his hand toward her, palm up in a gesture of offering rather than demand. Hannah's body screamed in pain from the fresh wounds across her shoulders. Her legs trembled with weakness from inadequate food and the shock of the moment. But somehow, she found the strength to push herself to her feet. She took one step toward the warrior, then another, each movement feeling like walking through deep water, fighting against a current that tried to pull her back into the familiar hell she had always known. "No." Josiah finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled cry rather than the commanding tone he usually employed. "She's my daughter. You can't just take her. This is kidnapping. This is war." The warrior's response was to speak again in Shawnee, his tone making clear that Josiah's claims held no weight, that the man who had just been caught in the act of brutal violence had forfeited any right to claim protection under the laws of civilization. Hannah crossed the cabin floor on unsteady legs, stepping over the pieces of the severed strap, moving past the fireplace where the flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, approaching the doorway where the warrior waited. As she drew close enough to take his offered hand, she caught his scent, leather and wood smoke and something else, something clean and wild like the forest after rain. His hand, when she finally placed hers in it, was warm and calloused and surprisingly gentle, closing around her fingers with a firmness that promised protection rather than possession. Together, they stepped through the shattered doorway and into the night. The October air hit Hannah's wounded back like ice water, making her gasp, but the warrior didn't slow his pace. He led her quickly across the clearing, past the chicken coop and the woodpile, toward the tree line, where two horses waited in the shadows. One was a paint mare with a blanket strapped across her back. The other a dark stallion that tossed its head impatiently as they approached. Behind them, Hannah heard Josiah's voice rising to a scream, calling for help, threatening retribution, promising that every settler in the territory would hunt them down. But his words faded as the warrior lifted Hannah onto the paint mare with surprising care, considering the urgency of their escape, then swung himself onto the stallion with the easy grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. He spoke softly to the horses in Shawnee, and they moved forward into the forest, leaving behind the only home Hannah had ever known. The ride through the night forest was like moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, from which Hannah couldn't quite wake. The warrior led them along paths she couldn't see, trails that seemed to exist only for those who knew where to look, winding between massive trees and across streams that reflected the pale light of a waning moon. Hannah clung to the mare's mane, her wounded back screaming with every movement, her mind struggling to process what had just happened and what might be waiting for her at the end of this journey. After what felt like hours, the warrior finally slowed their pace and turned to look back at Hannah. In the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy, she could see his face more clearly now, the paint that had seemed so fierce in the firelight revealing itself as ceremonial markings rather than war colors. His eyes, when they met hers, held concern rather than hostility, and when he spoke it was in halting English that surprised her. "You hurt bad. We stop soon. Clean wounds, then safe place." The words were simple, but they carried a promise that made something crack open in Hannah's chest. For the first time in 5 years, someone had acknowledged her pain not as something she deserved, but as something that required care. The realization hit her with such force that she couldn't hold back the tears that had been building behind her eyes since the moment the warrior had cut through the leather strap. They came to a small clearing beside a stream where the moonlight fell unobstructed on a carpet of moss, soft as any featherbed. The warrior dismounted and came to help Hannah down from the mare, his hands steadying her when her legs nearly gave way beneath her. He guided her to sit on a fallen log, then moved to the stream to fill a leather pouch with water. When he returned, he had also gathered handfuls of leaves that Hannah didn't recognize. This helped pain. "Stop bad spirits in wounds," he explained in his careful English as he crushed the leaves between his palms. He gestured to her torn dress, to the blood-soaked fabric clinging to her back. I help, or you do. You choose. The fact that he gave her a choice, that he waited for her permission rather than simply doing what he thought best, made Hannah realize just how completely her understanding of the world had been shaped by Josiah's cruelty. She had been taught that the Shawnee were savages without mercy or honor, yet here stood a warrior who had risked his own life to stop her beating, and who now asked her consent before offering medical care. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Help me!" The warrior nodded and moved behind her, his touch impossibly gentle as he carefully peeled away the ruined fabric of her dress to expose the damage Josiah's strap had inflicted. When he spoke again, his voice carried a cold fury that somehow didn't frighten her, because she understood instinctively that his anger was directed not at her, but at the man who had done this. "This not punishment, this torture, this evil," he said, his English becoming more strained as emotion overcame his careful pronunciation. "Men who do this have no honor, have no soul. Better he never born." As he cleaned her wounds with water from the stream and applied the crushed leaves whose astringent scent filled the clearing, Hannah felt layers of accumulated pain and shame beginning to lift. Each gentle touch seemed to carry a message. "You are not worthless, you did not deserve this, you are a human being worthy of care and compassion." By the time he had finished and carefully draped a soft deerskin over her shoulders to protect the treated wounds, Hannah felt as if she had been crying for hours, though her eyes were dry. "What's your name?" the warrior asked as he settled across from her, offering her strips of dried meat and a leather flask of water. Hannah took them gratefully, suddenly aware of a hunger that went deeper than her empty stomach. She bit into the meat and found it seasoned with herbs and smoke, more flavorful than anything she had tasted in years. "Hannah," she answered, her voice gaining strength. "Hannah Kimball, what's yours?" "Black Wolf," he replied, and then added something in Shawnee that she guessed was his full name in his own language. "A warrior of Chalicata Sept. I see your father kill my cousin 3 days before. I come for justice but find." He gestured to her bandaged back, his face hardening. "Find this evil instead." His words confirmed what Hannah had suspected. This rescue hadn't been planned, hadn't been part of some larger raid or strategy. Black Wolf had come seeking vengeance for his cousin's murder, and instead had stumbled upon a different kind of injustice, one that his warrior's code wouldn't allow him to ignore. "You'll be in trouble," Hannah said, surprised by her own concern for this stranger who had saved her. "For taking me. They'll come after you." Black Wolf's expression softened slightly, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "They come anyway. Always come. Always want more land, more trees, more everything. One girl or no girl, make no difference to hate." His words carried a weariness that spoke of years of conflict, of watching his people pushed further and further from the lands they had inhabited for generations. Hannah finished the dried meat and drank deeply from the water flask, feeling strength slowly returning to her battered body. "Where are we going?" she asked, part of her afraid of the answer, but needing to know what fate awaited her. Black Wolf looked up at the stars visible through the forest canopy, as if consulting with them about how much truth to share. "To my village. 3 days' ride if we move careful. My mother there, my sister's children. They help you heal. Then we decide what next." The mention of his family, of women and children waiting in a village somewhere deeper in the wilderness, made the Shawnee seem suddenly more human, less like the demonic savages of settler mythology. "Will they accept me?" The question came out smaller than Hannah intended, revealing the fear that had been growing since the moment she took Black Wolf's hand. "I'm white. I'm from the settlements. Everything I've been told says your people hate us." Black Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Hannah's face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "My people not hate all whites. We hate the ones who take and never give, who break treaties and kill our hunters and push us from our homes. But you," he gestured to her bandaged back, You not take nothing. You victim same as us. My mother understand this. She wise woman see truth others miss. Hannah wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that somewhere in the wilderness there might be a place where she could be accepted for who she was, rather than judged for what she represented. But 5 years of systematic cruelty had taught her to be cautious with hope, to protect herself from the crushing disappointment that came when trust was betrayed. Still, what choice did she have? She couldn't go back to the Kimball homestead, couldn't return to the nightly beatings and daily humiliations. We rest here until dawn, Black Wolf said, rising to tend to the horses. He removed their saddles and blankets, checked their hooves, and led them to the stream to drink. When he returned, he spread a thick buffalo hide on the ground near where Hannah sat. You sleep here. I keep watch. No one follow yet, but morning bring danger. We move fast when sun come. Hannah lay down on the buffalo hide, the soft fur, a luxury she had never experienced in her storage room pallet of straw and rough blankets. Above her, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, constellations she had seen her whole life but never really noticed. The forest around them sang with the sounds of night creatures, crickets and tree frogs and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. For the first time in 5 years, Hannah fell asleep without fear of what the morning might bring. Her back still ached from the wounds. Her future was utterly uncertain, and she was traveling deeper into wilderness with a man whose language she barely understood. But somehow, impossibly, she felt safer than she had in the cabin where she had been born. As consciousness faded, her last thought was of Black Wolf's hand cutting through the leather strap, severing not just the instrument of her torture, but the invisible chains that had bound her to a life of misery. Dawn broke over the Kentucky wilderness with a pale light that filtered through the canopy like liquid silver, and Hannah woke to find Black Wolf already moving about the camp with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to traveling light and fast. He had rekindled a small fire and was roasting something wrapped in leaves over the flames, the smell making Hannah's stomach clench with hunger despite the dried meat from the night before. When he noticed her stirring, he brought her water from the stream in a hollowed gourd, waiting patiently while she drank. "We leave soon," he said, gesturing toward the east where the sky was brightening moment by moment. "Your father's people will search when light comes. We need distance before they pick up trail." His English was improving with each exchange, as if speaking with Hannah was unlocking words he had learned long ago, but rarely used. She wondered where he had learned the language, who had taught him, and what other surprises this warrior might hold. Hannah stood slowly, testing her body's readiness for more riding. The wounds on her back had stiffened overnight, and the medicine Black Wolf had applied had formed a protective crust over the worst of the welts. It hurt to move, but the pain was manageable, nothing compared to the fresh agony of the night before. She accepted the food Black Wolf offered, some kind of root vegetable roasted until soft, and ate quickly while he packed their meager camp. As they prepared to mount the horses, Hannah caught sight of something that made her freeze. Through a gap in the trees she could see smoke rising in the distance, multiple columns that spoke of organized activity. Black Wolf followed her gaze, and his expression hardened. "They gather. Form search party, we go now." He lifted her onto the paint mare with hands that were gentle despite his urgency, then swung onto his stallion with fluid grace. They rode hard through the morning, following game trails that wound deeper into the wilderness, crossing streams to confuse their scent, doubling back and taking unexpected turns that would make tracking them nearly impossible for anyone not intimately familiar with the forest. Black Wolf navigated with an assurance that suggested he knew every tree and stone in these woods, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to Hannah's untrained eyes. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the Kimball homestead, but Black Wolf showed no signs of relaxing his vigilance. He kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to listen for sounds of pursuit, his entire body attuned to the rhythms of the forest in ways that seemed almost supernatural to Hannah. She found herself watching him with growing fascination. This man who moved through the wilderness like he was part of it. They stopped briefly at a spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, and while the horses drank, Black Wolf checked Hannah's wounds with the same gentle efficiency he had shown the night before. The medicine was working, he observed with satisfaction. Bad spirits leaving, you heal good. His confidence in her recovery was absolute, as if he could will her body to mend through sheer belief. As they rested, Hannah worked up the courage to ask questions that had been building in her mind since their flight began. "How did you learn English?" she asked, watching his face for reactions. Black Wolf was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant as if looking back through years of memory. "Missionary come to village when I young boy. He teach reading, writing, your language. He say we must learn white man's ways to survive in changing world." He paused, his expression growing darker. "He wrong. Learning your ways not save my people. Only teach us how much you want to take. But I keep language, keep reading. No enemy better when you understand his words." There was no hostility in his voice when he spoke of enemies, only a weary acceptance of reality. Hannah felt a strange kinship with that weariness, understanding what it meant to be on the receiving end of cruelty, justified by twisted logic. "What happened to the missionary?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Black Wolf's expression softened slightly. "A good man. Try to help, try to stop bad treaties, speak against land theft. Other whites not like this. They send him away, threaten him. Last I hear, he teaching at mission in Ohio Territory." He had real respect for this missionary, Hannah realized. Saw him as an exception to the rule of white treachery. They mounted again and continued their journey. The afternoon sun filtering through the turning leaves in shades of gold and crimson. The forest was alive with the sounds of creatures preparing for winter, squirrels chattering as they gathered nuts, birds calling their territories, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. Hannah had never been this deep in the wilderness, had never experienced the forest as anything other than a threatening darkness beyond the clearing's edge. But traveling with Black Wolf, she began to see it differently. He pointed out medicinal plants growing beside the trail, showed her the marks where bears had clawed trees, explained the meaning of different bird calls. The wilderness that had seemed hostile and alien from the confines of the Kimball homestead revealed itself as a complex, interconnected world that operated according to its own ancient logic. As evening approached, they came to a place where the forest opened onto a high ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Black Wolf reined in his horse and gestured for Hannah to look. Spread out beneath them was a landscape of unimaginable beauty. Rolling hills covered in forest that blazed with autumn color. A river winding through the valley like a silver ribbon, and in the distance, the blue shadows of mountains rising against the sky. "This, my people's land," Black Wolf said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sorrow. "For generations beyond counting, we hunt here, fish here, raise our children here. We know every stream, every hill, every sacred place. And now whites come, draw lines on paper, say this yours, this mine, as if land can be owned like blanket or cooking pot." His pain was palpable, the anguish of watching a way of life being systematically destroyed. Hannah didn't know what to say. She had grown up hearing that the land was there for the taking, that God had ordained white settlers to civilize the wilderness and put it to productive use. But standing on that ridge, looking at the vast expanse of forest that held centuries of Shawnee memory and meaning, she began to understand the magnitude of what was being lost. This wasn't empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was home, as real and meaningful to Black Wolf's people as any settler's cabin. They descended from the ridge as twilight gathered, and Black Wolf led them to a hidden hollow where a small cave offered shelter for the night. He built a fire near the cave's entrance, positioning it so the smoke would dissipate before rising above the tree line, making their camp nearly invisible to anyone searching from a distance. While he worked, Hannah gathered wood and tried to make herself useful, aware that her sheltered life had left her woefully unprepared for wilderness survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That night, as they sat by the fire, eating more of the dried meat and some wild berries Black Wolf had gathered, Hannah asked about his family. "Tell me about your mother. What is she like?" Black Wolf's stern expression softened in a way Hannah had not yet seen, revealing depths of feeling he normally kept carefully guarded. "My mother, Bright Moon, strongest woman I know. She survived winter sickness that kill many, survive hunger when crops fail, survive watching our land taken piece by piece. She teach me and my sister about old ways, about plants and animals, about spirits that live in all things. She teach us that strength not just in warrior's arm, but in heart that keeps loving even when world full of hate." He stared into the fire, his voice dropping lower. "When my father killed by settlers 5 winters ago, she not let hate consume her. She say hate like poison kill you from inside. Better to fight for life than fight from hate." Hannah absorbed this, thinking about how different Black Wolf's mother sounded from Constance, who had nurtured hatred like a prized garden and used it to justify every cruelty. "And your sister," she prompted gently, sensing that speaking of his family gave Black Wolf some comfort. "Running Deer. She, 2 years younger than me, married to good hunter named Tall Oak. They have 3 children, 2 boys and girl. She fierce protector like mother. When white soldiers come near village, she first to stand with warriors, bow in hand." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Hannah found herself envious of the bond Black Wolf clearly shared with his family. She had never experienced that kind of loyalty and love, had never known what it felt like to have someone stand beside you without reservation. "What will they think?" she asked quietly, "when you bring me to the village? Will they see me as the enemy?" Black Wolf turned his full attention to her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Some will, cannot lie about this. Many in village have lost family to settlers, lost homes, lost way of life. They see white face and remember pain. But my mother, she see deeper. She teach me that people not defined by skin color, but by actions, by heart. You not choose to be born white, just like I not choose to be born Shawnee. What matters is what we do with life we given." His words carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. And Hannah realized this warrior was not just a skilled fighter, but a thoughtful man who had grappled with complex questions about justice and humanity. She felt something stirring in her chest, not quite trust, but the beginning of it, the sense that perhaps Black Wolf truly meant to help her rather than harm her. "They will judge you by your actions," Black Wolf continued, poking at the fire with a stick. "You show respect, learn our ways, work hard, they will accept. Some faster than others, but eventually. My mother will help. She has strong voice in council, people listen when she speaks." His confidence in his mother's influence was absolute, suggesting she held a position of real authority in Shawnee society. Hannah pulled the deerskin tighter around her shoulders, feeling the evening chill creep into the hollow. "I don't know anything about your ways," she admitted. "I don't know your language, your customs, what's considered polite or rude. I'll make mistakes." Black Wolf nodded, as if this was perfectly obvious and not worth worrying about. Everyone make mistakes when learning new ways. What matters is willingness to learn, to listen, to try. You show that, people will be patient. He reached into a leather bag tied to his belt and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft doeskin. Opening it carefully, he revealed a string of shell beads, each one perfectly shaped and strung on sinew. "These belong to my cousin. The one your father killed. He was going to give them to girl he wanted to marry. Now he gone, girl grieves, beads have no purpose." He held them out to Hannah. "You take. Wear as sign that you under my family's protection. Anyone see these will know you not captive but guest." Hannah took the beads with trembling hands, understanding the profound significance of this gesture. Black Wolf was not just offering her jewelry, he was extending the protection of his family name, vouching for her in ways that would bind him to her fate. If she brought dishonor or trouble, it would reflect on him and his family. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders, alongside the deerskin wrap. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. I'm nobody, nothing. Why would you risk so much for someone like me? Black Wolf's expression grew fierce, his jaw tightening with emotion. You not nothing. You human being with right to live without fear, without pain. My cousin died because your father see him as nothing. I not let his death be meaningless. I save you because it right thing to do, because my cousin would want justice, not revenge, because cycle of killing must stop somewhere. His words hit Hannah with the force of revelation. Black Wolf had not rescued her on impulse or out of pity. He had made a conscious choice to break the cycle of violence, to answer murder with mercy, to transform his grief into something constructive rather than destructive. It was an act of profound moral courage, and Hannah understood with sudden clarity that she was witnessing something rare and precious. She fastened the shell beads around her neck, feeling their smooth weight against her skin. I'll honor this gift, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I'll prove worthy of your family's protection. I'll learn your ways and respect them. I'll work harder than anyone expects. I'll show them that not all whites are like my father. Black Wolf nodded, satisfied with her declaration, and Hannah felt as if she had just taken a sacred oath. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them, a symphony of crickets and tree frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Hannah had never felt so far from the world she had known, and yet paradoxically, she had never felt closer to understanding what it meant to be truly alive. As she prepared to sleep in the relative shelter of the cave, Black Wolf positioned himself at the entrance with his weapons close at hand. Before she closed her eyes, Hannah asked one more question. Black Wolf, why do you think your cousin's beads should go to me instead of the girl he wanted to marry? Wouldn't she want to keep them as a memory? Black Wolf was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. She says she cannot look at them without seeing his body in the forest, without remembering. She say better they go to someone who can wear them as symbol of life, not death, of hope, not grief. She very wise, that girl. She understand that objects have power we give them, and she choose to give these beads power to protect rather than power to hurt. Hannah clutched the beads in her hand, feeling their significance grow with each word Black Wolf spoke. She would wear them not just as protection, but as a reminder of the young hunter whose death had set these events in motion, whose loss had created a connection between two people who should have been enemies. As sleep finally claimed her, Hannah made a silent promise to the memory of Black Wolf's cousin that his death would lead to something better, something that justified the sorrow it had caused. The third day of their journey began with a cold rain that turned the forest path slick and treacherous, forcing Black Wolf to slow their pace as the horses picked their way carefully over wet roots and mossy stones. Hannah pulled the deerskin wrap tighter around her shoulders, but the dampness still seeped through, chilling her to the bone. Despite the discomfort, she refused to complain, determined to prove she could endure the hardships of wilderness travel without becoming a burden. By mid-morning, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards and turned every depression in the trail into a muddy stream. Black Wolf finally called a halt beneath the spreading branches of an enormous oak tree, whose dense canopy offered some protection from the worst of the weather. He helped Hannah dismount, his hands steadying her when she stumbled on legs stiff from hours in the saddle. We wait here until rain passes, he said, his breath misting in the cold air. Too dangerous to ride when cannot see trail clearly. One wrong step, horse breaks leg, we walk rest of way. He began unpacking supplies from his saddlebags, moving with the calm efficiency that Hannah had come to recognize as his natural state. Nothing seemed to rattle this warrior, not pursuit, not weather, not the weight of the choices he had made. While they waited, Black Wolf taught Hannah words in Shawnee, pointing to objects and speaking their names slowly so she could practice the unfamiliar sounds. Tree became Hearteasy, water became Nepi, sky was Kishthwa. Hannah repeated each word carefully, stumbling over the pronunciation but determined to learn. She noticed how Black Wolf's face would light up slightly when she got a word right, a subtle expression of pleasure that made her try even harder. The language felt strange in her mouth. The sounds formed differently than English, requiring her to use her tongue and throat in new ways. But there was something deeply satisfying about learning to name the world in Black Wolf's language, as if each new word opened a door to understanding his perspective. When she successfully said horse Mathihenwa without mangling the pronunciation, Black Wolf actually smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Good. You learn fast," he said, his approval warming Hannah more than any fire could. "Language important. Show respect when you try to speak our words, even if you make mistakes. Better to try and fail than not try at all." His philosophy seemed to extend to all aspects of life, this emphasis on effort and intention over perfect execution. It was so different from Josiah's approach, where any mistake brought punishment and any imperfection was evidence of fundamental worthlessness. As the rain continued, Black Wolf pulled out a small knife and a piece of wood and began carving with practiced movements. Hannah watched, fascinated, as a shape began to emerge from the wood. "What are you making?" she asked, leaning closer to see the details. Black Wolf held up the partially formed carving. "Turtle, for my youngest nephew. He loves animals, always asking me to carve new ones. I promise him turtle before I left on hunt." The tenderness in his voice when speaking of his nephew revealed yet another dimension to this complex man. Here was a feared warrior who spent his free time carving toys for children, who kept promises to little boys, who carried wood in his saddlebags specifically for this purpose. Hannah felt her understanding of what it meant to be strong, shifting and expanding to accommodate this new reality. "Will you teach me?" she asked impulsively. "To carve, I mean. I'd like to make something, to have a skill that's useful." Black Wolf considered her request, his dark eyes studying her face as if weighing her sincerity. Then he pulled out another piece of wood and a smaller knife, handing them to her carefully. "Start simple. Try to make smooth shape first. Don't worry about details. Feel the wood, understand its grain, work with it, not against it." For the next hour, as rain drummed on the leaves above them, Hannah learned the basics of wood carving under Black Wolf's patient instruction. Her first attempts were clumsy, the knife slipping and gouging where she wanted smooth curves. But Black Wolf never criticized, only showed her how to adjust her grip, how to angle the blade, how to read the wood's natural inclinations. It was the first time anyone had taught her a skill with such patience and encouragement. The rain finally began to ease as afternoon approached, and Black Wolf declared they could continue. They mounted the horses and set off again, following a ridgeline that offered glimpses of the valley below when the mist cleared enough to see. Hannah noticed they were climbing steadily now, moving into higher elevations where the trees grew differently and the air carried the sharp scent of pine. "We close now," Black Wolf announced as they crested a particularly steep section of trail. "Village beyond next valley, maybe 2 hours ride if we push." "You nervous?" He asked the question casually, but Hannah sensed genuine concern behind it. She considered lying, claiming confidence she didn't feel, but something about Black Wolf's directness invited honesty. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if they hate me? What if your mother takes one look at me and regrets your decision to bring me? What if the children are afraid, or the warriors decide I'm not worth the trouble I'll cause?" Black Wolf let his horse fall into step beside hers, close enough that their legs nearly touched. "Fear normal when facing unknown. But remember, you already survive worse thing. Anything that comes after cannot be worse than what you left behind." His logic was sound, but logic did little to calm the butterflies rioting in Hannah's stomach. Everything was about to change again, and she had no control over how the Shawnee would receive her, whether they would see her as guest or threat, whether she would find acceptance or merely a different kind of rejection. The shell beads around her neck suddenly felt very heavy, a symbol of protection that might prove insufficient against the weight of collective grief and anger. They descended into the valley as the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the dissipating mist. The forest here was old growth, with trees so massive that 5 men couldn't link hands around their trunks, their canopy so dense that little undergrowth survived beneath them. It felt like riding through a cathedral, and Hannah found herself holding her breath as if even normal breathing might disturb the sacred atmosphere. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, the village appeared. It was larger than Hannah had imagined, with perhaps 30 structures arranged in a rough circle around a central open space. The buildings were not the crude bark shelters she had expected from settler descriptions, but substantial longhouses with curved roofs covered in elm bark, their construction showing sophisticated engineering and craftsmanship. Smoke rose from openings in several roofs, and Hannah could see people moving about, engaged in various tasks. Black Wolf stopped at the edge of the tree line, giving Hannah time to absorb the scene before they entered. "At my mother's house." He pointed to a longhouse near the center of the village, distinguished by distinctive markings painted on its exterior. The red handprints and geometric patterns spoke of status and achievement. "We go there first. Let her know we arrived. Let her see you and make judgment." Hannah's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment that would determine her fate. She touched the shell beads at her throat like a talisman and straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I'm ready," she said, and was surprised to find it was almost true. Black Wolf nodded approvingly and urged his horse forward, Hannah following on the paint mare. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they entered the village, people stopped what they were doing to stare. Hannah felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, saw shock and confusion on many faces and on some unmistakable hostility. Children pointed and whispered. Women clutched their little ones closer. Men reached for weapons that weren't there. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Black Wolf rode straight to his mother's longhouse, seemingly unconcerned by the commotion their arrival had caused. He dismounted and came to help Hannah down, his movements deliberate and protective. "Stay close," he murmured. "Let me speak first, explain. Don't run even if frightened. Running make things worse." Hannah nodded, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. The door covering of the longhouse was pushed aside, and a woman emerged. She was perhaps 50 years old, her long black hair streaked with silver and bound in a complex braid. Her face showing the weathering of decades spent outdoors, but retaining a beauty that must have been striking in youth. She wore a dress of deerskin decorated with elaborate beadwork and porcupine quills, and around her neck hung multiple strands of shell beads that marked her status. Her dark eyes, so like Black Wolf's, swept over the scene with sharp intelligence. This was Bright Moon, and Hannah understood immediately why people listened when she spoke. The woman radiated authority and wisdom, her very presence commanding attention and respect. When her gaze landed on Hannah, those keen eyes narrowed, taking in every detail, from the ill-fitting settler dress to the fresh wounds visible on Hannah's arms, to the shell beads that Hannah wore like armor. Black Wolf stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in Shawnee, his hands moving in gestures that Hannah was learning accompanied serious conversation. She caught a few words she recognized, enough to understand he was explaining about Josiah, about the beating, about his decision to intervene. Bright Moon listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts, though her eyes never left Hannah's face. When Black Wolf finished speaking, silence stretched between mother and son. Then Bright Moon stepped closer to Hannah, circling her slowly, examining her from all angles like a horse trader assessing livestock. Hannah forced herself to remain still, to meet Bright Moon's eyes when they locked with hers, to show neither defiance nor cowering submission. She had learned from Black Wolf that respect was earned through bearing, through how one carried oneself in difficult moments. Finally, Bright Moon spoke, her voice clear and carrying despite not being raised. She spoke in Shawnee, and though Hannah couldn't understand the words, she heard questions in the tone. Black Wolf translated, his voice neutral. My mother asks why you wear my cousin's beads. She asks if you understand their meaning, their weight. She asks what makes you worthy of such protection. Hannah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, she directed her words to Bright Moon, trusting Black Wolf to translate accurately. I wear these beads because your son gave them to me as a symbol of his family's protection. I understand they belong to a young man whose life was stolen by my father's violence, a man who intended them as a gift of love before his future was taken from him. I don't know if I'm worthy of wearing them, but I promise to honor his memory and to prove through my actions that your son's mercy was not misplaced. As Black Wolf translated, Hannah watched Bright Moon's face for any reaction. The older woman's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, some assessment being made that Hannah couldn't read. When the translation was complete, Bright Moon spoke again, and this time her words were longer, more complex. My mother says. Black Wolf translated carefully. That revenge is easy but changes nothing, that mercy is hard but changes everything. She says my cousin's spirit came to her in dream 3 nights ago and told her a white girl with scarred back would come to village, would need healing of body and soul. She says dreams never lie, and you are the one from the vision. Hannah felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warm afternoon. Bright Moon had dreamed of her before Black Wolf had even found her, before any of this had happened. It suggested forces at work beyond simple chance, patterns and connections that defied rational explanation. Bright Moon stepped closer and reached out to touch the shell beads at Hannah's throat, her fingers tracing the smooth surfaces with something like reverence. Then, unexpectedly, Bright Moon smiled. It transformed her face completely, revealing warmth that had been hidden behind the stern assessment. She spoke again, and this time her tone was welcoming. My mother says you are welcome in our home. She says you will stay in the women's side of the longhouse with her and my sister, that she will teach you our ways and heal your wounds. She says anyone who offers you insult or harm will answer to her. Relief flooded through Hannah with such force that her knees weakened. Black Wolf caught her elbow, steadying her, his own expression showing satisfaction at his mother's acceptance. Other people had gathered around now, drawn by curiosity and the unusual sight of a white girl in their village. Bright Moon turned to address them, her voice ringing with authority as she spoke in rapid Shawnee. She tells them, Black Wolf translated quietly, that you are under our family's protection, that you are victim not enemy, that anyone with questions should bring them to her. She reminds them that our people have always judged others by actions not appearance, that to reject you without cause would shame our traditions. Hannah watched the crowd's reaction, saw skepticism on many faces, but also some softening, some willingness to give her a chance. A young woman pushed through the crowd, her face showing excitement rather than suspicion. She was perhaps 20 years old, her belly swollen with advanced pregnancy, and when she looked at Black Wolf, her face lit up with joy. She launched into animated speech, her hands gesturing expressively, and Black Wolf's stern expression melted into something approaching happiness. My sister running deer, he said to Hannah, affection clear in his voice. She says she is glad I'm home safe, that she worried when I stayed away longer than planned. She asks if this is the white girl from Mother's dream, if the prophecy comes true. His sister turned her attention to Hannah, her dark eyes curious and friendly rather than hostile. Running Deer reached out and took Hannah's hands in hers, speaking directly to her in Shawnee. Though Hannah couldn't understand the words, the warmth in the gesture was unmistakable. Black Wolf translated? She says, welcome, sister. She says, any friend of our family is her friend. She says, you must be tired and hungry from journey. Running Deer's acceptance felt like a gift, one more person willing to look past surface differences to the struggling human underneath. Children had crept closer now, their initial fear overcome by curiosity. They stared at Hannah with wide eyes, pointing at her pale skin and whispering among themselves. One brave little boy, perhaps 5 years old, reached out to touch Hannah's hand, then jerked back giggling when his fingers made contact, as if surprised to find her solid and real. The moment broke some of the tension, and several adults smiled at the child's antics. Bright Moon spoke again, this time with the clear tone of someone giving instructions. She gestured toward the longhouse, and Running Deer took Hannah's arm gently, guiding her toward the entrance. Black Wolf remained outside, presumably to deal with the horses and answer questions from the gathered villagers. As Hannah crossed the threshold into Bright Moon's home, she felt as if she were passing through more than just a doorway. She was entering a new life, one whose shape and meaning were still unknown, but which held the promise of something she had never experienced before. Belonging. The interior of the longhouse was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took Hannah's eyes a moment to adjust. The space was larger than she had expected, stretching back at least 40 feet, with a central corridor and platforms on either side that served as sleeping and living areas. A fire burned in a pit near the center, its smoke rising to escape through an opening in the roof. The air smelled of wood smoke and cooking food, and herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters. Bright Moon led Hannah to one of the platforms on the women's side of the house, gesturing for her to sit. Running Deer brought a wooden bowl filled with stew, pressing it into Hannah's hands with an encouraging smile. "Eat," Bright Moon said in heavily accented English, one of the few English words she apparently knew. Hannah realized this was a test of sorts, an offering of hospitality that she needed to accept gracefully. The stew was delicious, rich with meat and root vegetables and herbs that Hannah couldn't identify. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that Bright Moon was watching her carefully, still assessing, still deciding. When the bowl was empty, Running Deer refilled it without being asked, and Hannah understood she was expected to eat her fill, that refusing would be seen as rejection of their generosity. As she ate, Hannah observed the longhouse's interior more carefully. Several other women occupied various platforms, some working on tasks like sewing or preparing food, others tending to children or resting. They all watched Hannah with varying degrees of curiosity and wariness, but none approached or spoke. Hannah understood she would need to earn their acceptance individually. That Bright Moon's approval opened doors, but didn't guarantee welcome from everyone. When Hannah finally set aside the second bowl, too full to eat another bite, Bright Moon approached with a bundle wrapped in soft leather. She unfolded it to reveal a dress of deerskin, beautifully made and decorated with simple but elegant beadwork. She held it up against Hannah, checking the size, then nodded with satisfaction. "For you," she said in her accented English, pressing the dress into Hannah's hands. The gift brought tears to Hannah's eyes. This wasn't just clothing, it was acceptance, a tangible symbol that Bright Moon intended to incorporate Hannah into the community. Running Deer helped Hannah change out of her torn settler dress and into the deerskin garment, which fit surprisingly well, soft against her healing wounds. When Hannah emerged wearing Shawnee clothing, several of the watching women nodded approval, and one even offered a tentative smile. Bright Moon examined Hannah's back, clucking her tongue at the extent of the damage. She spoke rapidly to Running Deer, who disappeared and returned moments later with clay pots and bundles of herbs. For the next hour, Bright Moon treated Hannah's wounds with medicines that stung and soothed in equal measure. Her hands gentle but thorough, her expression focused with the concentration of a healer who took her work seriously. As Bright Moon worked, she began teaching Hannah words, pointing to the medicines and supplies and speaking their names. Hannah repeated each word, grateful for something to focus on besides the discomfort of having her wounds cleaned and treated. Gradually, the other women in the longhouse began to contribute, correcting Hannah's pronunciation or offering additional words, their participation a sign of tentative acceptance. By the time Bright Moon finished treating her wounds and wrapped her back in clean cloth, Hannah felt exhausted but also oddly hopeful. She had survived the first test, the initial encounter with Black Wolf's family and community. She had been accepted, provisionally at least, into Bright Moon's household. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of misunderstandings and mistakes and moments of doubt, but for the first time since Black Wolf had cut through the leather strap, Hannah felt like she might actually have a chance at building a new life. The first weeks in the Shawnee village passed in a blur of new experiences that challenged everything Hannah thought she knew about the world and her place in it. Each dawn brought lessons that stretched from sunrise to sunset. As Bright Moon took her education seriously, determined to transform this wounded settler girl into someone who could function within Shawnee society, Hannah threw herself into learning with desperate intensity, knowing that her survival depended not just on physical adaptation, but on proving her willingness to embrace a completely different way of life. The language remained her greatest challenge. Shawnee required sounds and tonal shifts that English never used, and Hannah spent hours each day practicing vocabulary with Running Deer, who had infinite patience for repetition and correction. They started with essential words for daily life, the names of foods and tools and activities, gradually building towards simple sentences that allowed Hannah to express basic needs and thoughts. Her mistakes often brought laughter, but it was gentle amusement rather than mockery, and Hannah learned to laugh at herself when she accidentally asked for a cooking stone instead of water, or called someone's baby a very small warrior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Bright Moon insisted Hannah learn not just words, but the stories embedded in the language. The ways that Shawnee speech reflected a worldview fundamentally different from settler thinking. In English, Hannah had learned to speak of land as property, of animals as resources, of nature as something separate from humanity that existed to be used and controlled. Shawnee language made no such distinctions, every word acknowledging the interconnection of all living things, the responsibility humans carried toward the natural world, the sacred relationships that bound everything together. The women of the longhouse gradually warmed to Hannah's presence as they watched her work without complaint at even the most tedious tasks. She learned to prepare hides, scraping away fat and tissue until her hands cramped and blistered, then rubbing the leather with mixtures of brain and liver until it became soft and supple. She learned to gather firewood, selecting dead branches that would burn clean rather than green wood that would smoke, learning to read the forest for what it offered rather than simply taking whatever was convenient. Corn grinding became a daily meditation, the rhythmic motion of stone against stone, producing the meal that formed the basis of so many dishes. Hannah worked alongside other women, and in the shared labor, she began to understand the social fabric of Shawnee life. Conversations flowed around her in a language she only partially understood, but she caught enough words and watched enough gestures to follow the general topics. Who was having trouble with a difficult child, whose husband had been successful on the hunt, what preparations needed to be made for the upcoming winter ceremonies. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, an older woman named Grey Dove approached Hannah while she was grinding corn outside the longhouse. Grey Dove had lost her entire family to settler violence years before, and she had been among the most hostile to Hannah's presence, her face showing undisguised contempt whenever their paths crossed. Hannah braced herself for confrontation, but Grey Dove simply sat down nearby and began her own grinding, working in silence for several minutes before speaking. Black Wolf translated later what Grey Dove had said, because Hannah's Shawnee wasn't yet good enough to catch all the nuances. Grey Dove had told her that hate was heavy to carry, that she had carried it for 5 years until it bent her back and stole her joy, that watching Hannah work honestly and humbly had reminded her that revenge against the innocent changed nothing about the past. She said that Hannah's willingness to learn Shawnee ways showed respect, and respect deserved recognition even when it came from unexpected sources. The conversation marked a turning point in Hannah's acceptance. If Grey Dove, who had every reason to reject her, could find space for reconciliation, then others felt permission to do the same. Women who had kept their distance began including Hannah in their conversations, teaching her the finer points of beadwork and quillwork. showing her how to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs in the forests surrounding the village. Children who had initially feared her strange pale skin now sought her out, fascinated by her attempts to speak their language, and delighted when she made mistakes that sent them into fits of giggles. Black Wolf maintained a respectful distance during those early weeks, allowing Hannah space to establish herself among the women without his constant presence complicating matters. But Hannah saw him around the village, watched him train younger warriors in combat techniques, observed how he interacted with elders with deep respect and with children with gentle patience. She noticed how other women looked at him with obvious interest, several unmarried young women making their availability clear through gestures and glances that transcended language barriers. The observation stirred something unexpected in Hannah's chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name, but that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. She had no claim on Black Wolf beyond gratitude for her rescue, no right to feel possessive of his attention. Yet she found herself watching to see which women he favored with conversation, whether he returned their obvious interest. The confusion of her own feelings kept her awake some nights, lying on her sleeping platform, trying to understand what was happening in her heart. Running Deer noticed because very little escaped her sharp eyes, despite her advancing pregnancy. One evening, as they worked together preparing vegetables for the communal meal, Running Deer spoke quietly in a mixture of Shawnee and simple English that Hannah could follow. "My brother, good man. Many women want him, but he not see them. He see only you." Her words were matter-of-fact, delivered without judgment but with clear significance. Hannah's hands stilled in their work, her heart suddenly pounding. "That's not possible," she replied in her halting Shawnee. "I'm white. I'm an outsider. I bring trouble to him and your family. Why would he want someone like me?" Running Deer laughed softly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "You not understand yet. My brother not care about skin color. He care about spirit, about heart. He see your strength, your courage, your willingness to change. These things matter more than where you born." Before Hannah could respond, a commotion erupted near the village entrance. Shouts and the sound of running feet brought everyone out of the longhouses, and Hannah followed Running Deer as quickly as the pregnant woman could move. A group of warriors had returned from patrol, and they were bringing news that sent waves of tension through the gathered villagers. Black Wolf appeared at his mother's side, speaking rapidly, while Bright Moon's face grew increasingly grave. Hannah caught enough words to understand the basics. Settlers were organizing a large search party. Rumors had spread about a white girl taken by Shawnee warriors, and men from multiple settlements were joining forces to find her and punish whoever had taken her. Josiah had apparently convinced other settlers that Hannah had been kidnapped against her will, was being held captive and abused, and that righteous action was required to save her and teach the savages a lesson about taking white women. The irony would have been laughable if the situation wasn't so dangerous. Josiah, who had beaten her nightly and made her life a living hell, was now playing the concerned father demanding her return. But Hannah understood the truth beneath his performance. This wasn't about recovering his stepdaughter. It was about pride and control, and the convenient excuse her disappearance provided for escalating conflict with the Shawnee. Men like Josiah always found justifications for their violence, and Hannah's rescue had handed him a perfect pretext. Black Wolf caught Hannah's eye across the crowd, his expression serious but not afraid. He made his way through the gathered villagers until he stood before her, very aware that everyone was watching their interaction. He spoke in English so she would understand perfectly. "You have choice. You can go back. Tell settlers you came willingly. Try to stop conflict. No one here will force you to stay if you want to leave." Hannah felt every eye in the village turn toward her, felt the weight of a decision that would affect not just her own fate, but potentially the lives of everyone around her. Going back meant returning to Josiah's control, to the nightly beatings and daily degradation, to a life where she existed only as an object of contempt and abuse. But staying meant risking war, meant potentially being responsible for deaths on both sides of a conflict she had inadvertently sparked. She thought about the past weeks, about bright moon's patient teaching and running deer's warm acceptance, about grey dove's difficult reconciliation and the children who now played around her without fear, about the women who had welcomed her into their work circles and the language that was slowly becoming less foreign in her mouth. She thought about what it meant to have a place where she was valued, not despite her differences, but as a whole person worthy of respect and care. And she thought about Black Wolf, about the way her heart lifted when she saw him across the village, about the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, about the safety she felt in his presence that went beyond physical protection to something deeper and more profound. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. She had fallen in love with this warrior who had cut through more than just a leather strap, who had severed the chains of her old life and offered her the possibility of something she had never imagined possible. "I'm not going back," Hannah said clearly in Shawnee, wanting everyone to understand her choice. "This is my home now. These are my people. Whatever comes, I face it here." The words were simple, but their meaning was absolute. She was choosing the Shawnee over the settlers, choosing this new life over the familiar misery, choosing to stand with people who had given her more in a few weeks than her own family had given her in 17 years. Bright Moon stepped forward and placed both hands on Hannah's shoulders, speaking in a voice that carried to every listener. Black Wolf didn't need to translate because Hannah had learned enough Shawnee to understand. Bright Moon was formally adopting her into the family, declaring before the entire village that Hannah was now her daughter, that Black Wolf was now her brother, that Running Deer was now her sister. The words carried legal and social weight in Shawnee society, binding Hannah permanently into the kinship networks that structured everything about their world. The implications were staggering. As Bright Moon's adopted daughter, Hannah gained all the protections and responsibilities of that position. She was no longer a guest or outsider, but a full member of the community, with rights and obligations that went both ways. Several women came forward to embrace her, welcoming her formally into the tribe. And Hannah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized she finally belonged somewhere. Finally had a family who wanted her not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was. But the moment of joy was tempered by the reality of the approaching threat. The village council gathered that evening to discuss defense strategies, and because Hannah was now formally part of Bright Moon's family, she was permitted to attend, along with her adopted mother. She sat quietly in the circle as warriors and elders debated their options, her improving Shawnee allowing her to follow most of the discussion. Some argued for abandoning the village temporarily, moving deeper into the wilderness until the settler anger cooled and the search party gave up. Others insisted on staying and preparing to defend their homes, setting up warning systems and organizing warriors into defensive positions. A few suggested offering to meet with the settlers under terms of truce, to negotiate and explain that Hannah had come willingly and was now under tribal protection. The debate grew heated as different factions pushed their preferred strategies. Black Wolf finally stood to speak, and immediate silence fell. He commanded respect not through volume or aggression, but through the careful wisdom of his words. He acknowledged the validity of different viewpoints, then laid out his own assessment. Running would solve nothing, he argued, because settlers would simply see it as confirmation of guilt and would pursue them deeper into Shawnee territory. Fighting would result in deaths on both sides and would escalate conflict beyond anyone's ability to control. The only path that offered hope of peace was direct communication. He proposed that he and Hannah ride out to meet the search party under flag of truce. That Hannah speak directly to the settlers and make clear she had not been taken against her will. He acknowledged the risk, understood that angry men might not listen to reason, but argued that the attempt had to be made. If it failed, they would still have time to prepare defenses. But if it succeeded, they might prevent bloodshed and begin building toward better understanding between their peoples. The council debated long into the night before finally agreeing to Black Wolf's proposal, though with strict conditions. Other warriors would accompany them at a distance, ready to intervene if the settlers showed treachery. Bright Moon would send a formal message through her network of connections, alerting other Shawnee villages about the situation in case broader support became necessary. And Hannah would be given the opportunity to refuse the plan, to choose safety over the risk of confronting Josiah and other hostile settlers. When the council turned to Hannah for her response, she stood on shaking legs, very aware that everyone was watching this newest member of their community face her first real test. She spoke in Shawnee, her words careful but clear. "If my voice can prevent war, then I must use it. If my testimony can show settlers that Shawnee people act with honor, then I must give it. I'm afraid, but fear is not reason enough to stay silent when silence might cost lives." Bright Moon's face showed fierce pride, and several warriors nodded approval at Hannah's courage. Black Wolf's expression revealed something deeper and more complex, a mixture of respect and concern, and something that might have been love, though Hannah hardly dared believe it. The council concluded with agreements about timing and logistics, and Hannah returned to the longhouse feeling as if she had aged years in a single evening. That night, unable to sleep, Hannah slipped out of the longhouse and walked to the edge of the village where she could see the stars overhead. She stood there remembering the girl she had been just weeks before, broken and hopeless, believing she had no value and no future. That girl seemed like someone from another lifetime, separated from who Hannah was becoming by an unbridgeable chasm of experience and transformation. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Black Wolf approaching, his presence somehow both calming and electrifying. He stood beside her in silence for several moments, both of them looking up at the familiar constellations that had guided Hannah through so many dark nights. When he finally spoke, his English was more fluent than usual, as if he had been practicing what he wanted to say. "You very brave." His voice was soft but certain. "Most people, they run from hard choices. You run toward them. This is quality of true warrior, not skill with weapons but courage to do right thing even when afraid." Hannah turned to look at him, finding his dark eyes already watching her face. "I'm only brave because you showed me how," she replied quietly. "You could have walked away that night. You could have let Josiah continue what he was doing. But you chose mercy over revenge, chose to save someone who meant nothing to you. You not nothing." Black Wolf interrupted gently. "Never nothing. From first moment I see you. I see strength hiding under pain, see spirit that refused to break even when body breaking. I see person worth saving." His words wrapped around Hannah's heart like a blanket, warming places that had been cold for so long she had forgotten what warmth felt like. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, because she needed to know if he shared the fear that was keeping her awake. Black Wolf was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Tomorrow we try to stop war before it starts. Maybe we succeed, maybe we fail. But either way, you show settlers and Shawnee both that bridge between peoples is possible, that hate not only option. This matter more than what happens to us." The words "us" hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Hannah gathered her courage, the same courage that had allowed her to leave Josiah's cabin and embrace a new life. "What are we?" she asked directly. "You and me. What is this between us?" Black Wolf smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face. "In my culture, we believe spirits recognize each other across time and distance. I think my spirit knew yours before we ever met, knew you were coming, knew you would change everything." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "When this is over, when danger passes, I want to court you properly, want to give you choice without pressure. But I need you to know my heart already yours, has been since I saw you choose freedom over familiar chains." Hannah felt tears gathering, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I don't need time," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion. "My heart chose you the moment you cut through that strap. Everything after has just been my head catching up to what my heart already knew." Black Wolf pulled her closer, and Hannah went willingly into his embrace, resting her head against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. They stood like that under the stars, two people from worlds that were supposed to be enemies, finding in each other something that transcended every boundary society had tried to impose. Tomorrow would bring danger and difficult choices, but tonight they had this moment of peace, this declaration of feeling that made everything else worthwhile. When Hannah finally returned to the longhouse, she found Running Deer still awake despite the late hour, sitting by the low fire cradling her belly. Her sister smiled knowingly, having clearly anticipated where Hannah had gone and what might have transpired. "About time," Running Deer said in English, her tone teasing but affectionate. "Whole village sees how you look at each other. Only you two blind enough to not see it." Hannah laughed quietly, not wanting to wake the other sleeping women. "Is it always this terrifying?" she asked. "Loving someone, knowing you could lose them?" Running Deer's expression grew more serious. "Love always has risk. My husband hunts, he fights. Every day I wonder if he comes home. But life without love, that not living, that just waiting to die. You choose to truly live, Hannah. This brave thing." They sat together in comfortable silence, two sisters from different worlds, finding common ground in the universal experiences of women, learning to navigate love and danger and the complicated business of building lives worth living. When Hannah finally lay down to sleep, her mind was quieter than it had been in weeks. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it not alone, but surrounded by family who valued her, protected by love she had earned, and strengthened by the knowledge that she had already survived the worst thing and come out the other side transformed. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning where breath misted in the air and frost painted delicate patterns on every surface. Hannah woke before the other women in the longhouse, her stomach twisted with anticipation and dread about what the day would bring. She dressed carefully in the deerskin clothing that Bright Moon had given her, braided her hair in the Shawnee style that Running Deer had taught her, and fastened the shell beads around her neck like armor against what was to come. Bright Moon was already awake, tending the fire and preparing corn cakes for breakfast. When she saw Hannah, she gestured for her to sit and eat, pressing warm food into her hands with the insistence of someone who understood that courage required fuel. They ate in silence, the older woman's presence offering comfort without needing words. When the meal was finished, Bright Moon took Hannah's face in both hands and spoke in slow, careful Shawnee, so Hannah would understand every word. "You carry our honor today. Not just your own story, but proof that two peoples can choose understanding over war. This heavy burden for young woman, but I see your strength. You will not fail." The confidence in Bright Moon's voice steadied Hannah's racing heart, reminding her that she didn't face this challenge alone, but carried the support of her adopted family and the hopes of an entire community seeking peace. Black Wolf was waiting outside with the horses already prepared for the journey. He had painted his face not with war colors, but with the marks of peaceful negotiation, patterns that signaled his intention to talk rather than fight. 3 other warriors stood nearby, their faces also painted for peace, but their weapons clearly visible, a reminder that peaceful intentions didn't mean defenseless vulnerability. They would follow at a distance, close enough to intervene if treachery occurred, but far enough back not to appear threatening. Hannah mounted the paint mare that had carried her to the village weeks before, the horse nickering softly in recognition. Black Wolf swung onto his stallion with his characteristic grace, then turned to address the small crowd that had gathered to see them off. He spoke in Shawnee, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air, words that Hannah now understood well enough to follow without translation. "We go to speak truth, to show that honor exists on both sides when people choose to see it. Whatever happens today, remember that peace is always worth pursuing, that every war starts with someone deciding violence is easier than understanding. We choose the harder path because it is the right path." His words carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about the consequences of violence, who had seen enough blood to know that victory in battle rarely solved the underlying problems that caused conflict. They rode out from the village as the sun climbed above the tree line, following the trail back toward settler territory. The journey that had taken 3 days in flight would take less than a day riding directly, and Black Wolf set a steady pace that would bring them to the arranged meeting place by early afternoon. They had sent word ahead through a French trapper who moved freely between both communities, proposing a location that was neutral ground, a clearing beside a stream that neither settlers nor Shawnee claimed as exclusively theirs. As they rode, Black Wolf talked to Hannah about what to expect, how to handle potential hostility, what to say if settlers refused to believe her testimony. Stay calm no matter what they say, he advised. Anger makes people not listen. You speak truth clearly, let your scars tell story your words support. No one can look at your back and believe you were treated well before you came to us. The logic was sound, but Hannah worried that logic might not matter to men whose minds were already made up. They reached the meeting place an hour before the appointed time, allowing Black Wolf to scout the area and position his backup warriors in concealed locations where they could observe without being obvious. Then he and Hannah waited in the clearing, visible and vulnerable, demonstrating their commitment to peaceful engagement. The sound of the stream provided a gentle counterpoint to Hannah's racing heartbeat as the sun climbed higher and the appointed hour approached. The settlers arrived exactly on time, a group of about 20 men on horseback, armed with rifles and riding with the tense alertness of people expecting ambush. Hannah recognized several faces from the settlement, men who had known her father, who had attended the same church, who had seen her around but never really looked at her. And there, at the front of the group, rode Josiah Kimball, his face set in hard lines of righteous anger that Hannah knew was performative rather than genuine. Nadu, the two groups faced each other across the clearing, separated by perhaps 50 yards of open ground. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, every man on both sides ready to reach for weapons at the slightest provocation. Then Josiah spotted Hannah, and his expression transformed into something that might have convinced others it was relief and joy, but that Hannah recognized as fury barely contained beneath a false mask. "Hannah," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance with theatrical volume. "Thank God you're alive. These savages told us you came willingly, but we knew that couldn't be true. Come here, daughter. Come back to your family where you belong." The words were calculated to paint her as victim, and the Shawnee as villains, to justify whatever violence he had planned, regardless of what she might say. Hannah urged her horse forward slowly, stopping halfway between the two groups where both sides could hear her clearly. She sat straight in the saddle, projecting a confidence she had learned from watching Black Wolf, from absorbing the dignity that Bright Moon carried like a second skin. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, amplified by the acoustics of the clearing. "I am not your daughter. I never was. You made that clear every night when you beat me, every day when you told me I was worthless and broken and deserved nothing better than the charity you claimed to provide." The blunt truth of her words sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled settlers. This was not the narrative Josiah had sold them, not the story of innocent captive grateful for rescue. Hannah continued, her voice gaining strength as years of suppressed anger found an outlet. "You beat me until I bled. You starved me and worked me and told me I had no value. When Black Wolf found you in the act of whipping me, he did what any person of honor would do. He stopped you. And when he offered me a choice between staying with you and leaving with him, I chose freedom. No one forced me. No one kidnapped me. I left because anything was better than one more day in your house." The settlers shifted uneasily, some clearly uncomfortable with this version of events that contradicted what they had been told. Josiah's face flushed red with rage barely contained. "She's been brainwashed," he insisted, his voice tight. "These savages have filled her head with lies, turned her against her own people. She doesn't know what she's saying." But several men in his party were looking at Josiah differently now, remembering perhaps rumors they had heard, instances of cruelty they had witnessed but chosen to ignore. Hannah pulled her deerskin shirt up to expose her back, turning so both groups could see the crisscrossing scars that told their own undeniable story. "These are not lies," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. These are the marks of your love and Christian charity. Look at them and tell me I should go back to that. Tell me what father does this to a child in his care. Tell me what justifies torture in the name of discipline. The silence that followed was profound. Several settlers looked away, unable to meet Hannah's eyes, confronted with evidence that challenged the comfortable narrative they had accepted. One older man, a farmer Hannah recognized as generally decent though weak-willed, spoke up hesitantly. "Josiah, you never mentioned the girl was scarred like that. You said she was troubled, but not that you had cause to discipline her so severely." Josiah's control began cracking, his true nature showing through the righteous father performance. "She needed correction," he snapped. "She was disobedient and willful and needed to learn her place. What I did in my own home is no business of savages or anyone else." His words damned him more effectively than any accusation, revealing the cruelty and sense of absolute authority that had made Hannah's life a living hell. Black Wolf moved his horse forward to stand beside Hannah, his presence supportive but not threatening. He spoke in clear English, addressing the assembled settlers with the same dignity he brought to council meetings in his village. "Among my people, man who treats child this way loses honor, loses respect, loses right to speak in council. We judge people by how they treat weakest among them. Woman who came to us was broken by your culture's cruelty. We offered healing and respect. This is savage behavior you condemn." His words challenged every assumption the settlers had made about civilization and barbarism, about who held moral authority and who needed to be taught proper behavior. Several men in Josiah's party were now openly questioning whether they should be there at all, whether they had been manipulated into supporting something that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with one man's wounded pride. One of the more thoughtful settlers, a man named Thomas Bradford, who served as informal leader in the community, urged his horse forward cautiously. He addressed Hannah directly, his tone respectful. "Miss Kimball, are you truly saying you wish to stay with the Shawnee of your own free will, that you prefer their company to returning to the settlement? This isn't coercion or fear-speaking, but genuine choice." Hannah met his eyes squarely, putting all her conviction into her response. "I'm saying that in 3 weeks with the Shawnee, I have been treated with more dignity and kindness than in 17 years among settlers. I've been adopted into Black Wolf's family, given a home and purpose and the respect every human deserves. When I speak of my people now, I mean the Shawnee. This is where I belong. This is where I choose to stay." Bradford nodded slowly, absorbing her words and their implications. Then he turned to address Josiah and the other settlers. "It seems to me we rode out here on false pretenses. This girl wasn't taken against her will. She fled abuse and found refuge. That's not kidnapping. That's escape. I'll not be party to dragging her back to more beatings simply because Kimball's pride is wounded." Several other men voiced agreement, the group fracturing as the truth undermined Josiah's narrative. But Josiah wasn't finished. His face contorted with rage as he saw control slipping away, as the careful story he had constructed collapsed under the weight of Hannah's testimony. "You ungrateful wretch," he snarled, his true venom finally breaking free. "After everything I provided, shelter and food and a place in my home, you betray me like this. You side with savages against your own kind. You're no better than an animal." His hand moved toward the rifle at his saddle, and everything happened at once. Black Wolf's warriors emerged from concealment, arrows nocked and ready. The settlers' hands went to their own weapons. Hannah's horse danced nervously, sensing the sudden spike in tension. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the clearing balanced on a knife edge between peace and violence, between understanding and bloodshed. Then Bradford's voice cut through the tension like a bell. "Stand down, all of you," he commanded, his authority carrying weight among the settlers. He turned to Josiah with disgust clear on his weathered face. "Put your weapon away, Kimball. You've lost." The girl's made her choice clear, and frankly, hearing what she's had to say, I can't blame her. Any man who'd treat a child that way doesn't deserve to call himself a father. The moment held, balanced between possible futures, And then slowly, grudgingly, hands moved away from weapons on both sides. The Shawnee warriors remained visible, but lowered their bows. The settlers relaxed slightly in their saddles. The crisis point had passed, disaster averted by the thin margin of one man's moral courage and the weight of undeniable truth. Bradford addressed Black Wolf directly, respect in his tone. "I apologize that you and your people were dragged into our settlement's problems. The girl has made her choice clear, and I'll carry word back that she's where she wants to be. I can't speak for everyone, but those of us with any sense will leave you in peace." He paused, then added, "Maybe this can be the start of better relations between us. God knows there's been enough killing on both sides." Black Wolf inclined his head, acknowledging the olive branch. "My people want peace. Want to live on our land, raise our children, honor our traditions. We ask only respect and for treaties to be honored. Perhaps you are a man who can help build bridge between our peoples." Bradford nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps I am. We'll be leaving now." He shot a hard look at Josiah, "All of us. And there'll be no more talk of rescue missions or righteous vengeance." The matter's settled. As the settlers turned their horses to leave, Josiah remained frozen in his saddle, staring at Hannah with undisguised hatred. "You'll regret this," he said, the words carrying the weight of curse rather than prediction. "You've thrown away everything for savages who'll tire of you soon enough. Then you'll have nowhere to go, no one to turn to." Hannah met his glare without flinching, without the fear that would have paralyzed her weeks before. "I already have everything I need," she replied calmly. "I have family who values me, a home where I'm respected, and freedom from your cruelty. Whatever regrets I might have in life, leaving you will never be among them." The finality in her voice seemed to penetrate even Josiah's rage, and he understood that he had truly lost, that Hannah was beyond his reach forever. He wheeled his horse violently and galloped after the departing settlers, leaving dust and impotent fury in his wake. When the last settler had disappeared into the trees, Hannah felt her composure crumble. She had held herself together through sheer force of will, but now that the danger had passed, reaction set in. Her hands began shaking, her breath coming in gasps, tears flowing freely down her face. Black Wolf was beside her instantly, helping her dismount, holding her while she shook with the release of tension she had been containing. "You did it," he said softly, his voice full of pride and relief. "You stood before your worst nightmare and spoke truth without fear. You prevented war and showed both peoples that bridge is possible. You are the strongest person I know." His words helped anchor Hannah, reminding her that she had not just survived, but had accomplished something significant, had turned her pain into purpose and her fear into courage. The journey back to the village was triumphant. Word of the successful negotiation had somehow preceded them, carried by runners who had witnessed from concealment, and the entire community turned out to welcome them home. Children cheered, women ululated in celebration, warriors raised their weapons in salute. Hannah rode through the village, feeling not like a rescued victim, but like a hero returning from successful quest. That evening, the village held a feast to celebrate the peaceful resolution and to formally recognize Hannah's new status as full member of the tribe. Bright Moon dressed her in the finest deerskin, decorated with elaborate beadwork that had taken weeks to create. Running Deer styled her hair with feathers and beads, transforming her into someone who moved easily between two worlds while being fully committed to the one she had chosen. During the feast, Black Wolf stood before the assembled community and made a formal declaration. Speaking in Shawnee that Hannah now understood fluently enough to catch every nuance, he announced his intention to court Hannah according to traditional customs, to seek her agreement to become his wife when appropriate time had passed for proper courtship. The announcement brought cheers and approval from the gathering. Validation that their relationship had community support. Bright Moon rose and added her voice, speaking with the authority of family matriarch and tribal elder. She declared that Hannah had proven herself worthy not just of adoption, but of full acceptance as Shawnee, that her courage and commitment had earned her place among them. She announced that Hannah would receive a new name, one that reflected her journey and transformation, River Hawk. For like the river, she had traveled far from her source to find where she truly belonged, and like the hawk, she had found her true strength and freedom. The name settled on Hannah like a blessing, marking the completion of her transformation from broken settler girl to strong Shawnee woman. When people called her Riverhawk, she would remember that she had chosen this life, fought for it, proved worthy of it. The old name Hannah Kimball belonged to someone who no longer existed, replaced by this new person who knew her own value and stood firm in her convictions. As the feast continued late into the night with dancing and storytelling, Black Wolf found Riverhawk at the edge of the celebration and drew her aside to a quiet spot beneath the stars. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, absorbing the significance of all that had happened. The distance they had traveled together from that violent night in Josiah's cabin to this moment of peace and belonging. I never imagined anything like this was possible, Riverhawk said quietly, her hand finding Black Wolf's in the darkness. I thought my life would be nothing but survival and suffering until I died. You gave me so much more than rescue. You gave me the chance to become who I was always meant to be. Black Wolf brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart ache. You gave yourself that chance, he corrected gently. I only cut rope. You did the hard work of healing, of learning, of choosing courage over fear. That all came from inside you, from spirit that refused to break, no matter how much pressure was applied. I just honored what I saw in you that first moment. Riverhawk leaned against his shoulder, feeling truly safe and loved for the first time in her life. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and joys in equal measure. Riverhawk and Black Wolf married in a ceremony that blended Shawnee traditions with new rituals they created together, symbolizing the bridge they represented between worlds. They had children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, who grew up speaking both languages and understanding both cultures, who embodied the possibility of peace and mutual respect. Riverhawk became known as a healer and mediator, using her unique position to help facilitate understanding between settlers and Shawnee. She never forgot where she came from or what she had survived, and that memory gave her credibility with both peoples. Some settlers saw her as traitor, but others recognized her as bridge builder, someone who could translate not just words, but values and perspectives between cultures that needed to learn from each other. Josiah never troubled her again. Word reached the village years later that he had died alone and unmourned, his cruelty having eventually alienated everyone around him. Riverhawk felt neither grief nor satisfaction at the news, only a distant pity for a man who had chosen hate over love and had paid the ultimate price in loneliness and bitterness. Running Deer gave birth to a healthy daughter and remained Riverhawk's closest friend and sister, their bond strengthening over years of shared experience. Bright Moon lived to see her grandchildren grow, her wisdom and guidance shaping not just her own family, but the entire village. The community prospered, adapting to changing times while maintaining core values that defined their identity. On quiet evenings, when the children were settled and the day's work complete, Riverhawk would sometimes sit beneath the stars with Black Wolf, remembering that desperate girl who had taken a warrior's hand and stepped into the unknown. That choice, made in a moment of crisis and courage, had led to everything that followed, to love and family and purpose and peace. The story of the girl who was whipped every night until a Shawnee warrior slashed through the rope became legend, told around fires in both settler cabins and Shawnee villages. But those who knew the truth understood it wasn't really about rescue at all. It was about recognition, about one person seeing another's humanity clearly enough to act on it, about the transformative power of choosing mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. Riverhawk lived to old age, her silver hair a crown of wisdom, her scarred back a map of survival, her life a testament to the truth that where we come from matters less than who we choose to become. She died surrounded by children and grandchildren from both cultures, living proof that bridges between peoples are built not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of courage, compassion, and commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone. And in the end, that was the real story worth telling. Not about a victim who was saved, but about a survivor who saved herself by finding the courage to leave behind everything familiar and step into a life that honored her worth. That courage, more than anything else, was what changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone whose life she touched, rippling outward in ways large and small, proving that one person's choice to embrace transformation can indeed change the world. 3 years had passed since the day Riverhawk stood in that clearing and chose her future with words that prevented bloodshed and changed the course of countless lives. The seasons had turned their eternal wheel, bringing winters that tested endurance and summers that promised abundance. And through it all, the village beside the river had grown and evolved, shaped by the peace that one woman's courage had helped establish. Riverhawk stood at the edge of the cornfield in the early morning light, one hand resting on her swollen belly where her third child grew, watching the mist rise from the river like spirits ascending to greet the new day. At 20 years old, she had lived more than many people experienced in twice as many years, had traveled from the depths of despair to heights of contentment she hadn't known existed. The scars on her back remained, permanent reminders of where she had come from, but they no longer defined her. Black Wolf emerged from their home, their 2 daughters clutching his hands as they stumbled along on unsteady toddler legs. Little Bright Star was 2 years old, named for her grandmother whose wisdom continued to guide the family. Swift Fox had just celebrated her first winter, already showing signs of the fierce independence that characterized both her parents. Black Wolf's face softened with love as he watched them toddle toward their mother, and Riverhawk felt her heart expand with gratitude for this life she had built. "Good morning, my loves," Riverhawk said, crouching awkwardly with her pregnant belly to embrace both daughters. "Did you sleep well?" Bright Star launched into an animated description of a dream involving rabbits and butterflies, her storytelling already showing the dramatic flair she had inherited from her father. Swift Fox simply hugged her mother's neck and made happy sounds, content to be held. Black Wolf came to stand beside his wife, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Council meets today to discuss the treaty proposals from Bradford's settlement," he said quietly, his tone mixing hope and wariness. "They want to formalize trade agreements, establish clear boundaries, create system for resolving disputes without violence. It could change everything." Riverhawk nodded, understanding the delicate balance required. Thomas Bradford had proven himself a man of his word in the 3 years since that confrontation, working steadily to build bridges between his settlement and the Shawnee villages. But not all settlers shared his vision, just as not all Shawnee trusted white promises after generations of broken treaties. "I'll attend the council meeting," Riverhawk said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "My presence reminds both sides that understanding is possible, that people can change." Black Wolf squeezed her shoulder gently, his pride in her evident. In 3 years of marriage, she had become not just his wife, but his partner in the truest sense, someone whose counsel he valued and whose judgment he trusted completely. The council gathered at midday in the largest longhouse, arranged in a circle that placed everyone at equal status. Riverhawk took her place beside Black Wolf, very aware that her presence was still somewhat controversial, even after 3 years. Some elders remained skeptical of her loyalty, wondering if crisis might reveal her true allegiance to her birth people. Thomas Bradford arrived with a small delegation, men and women who had worked alongside him to build peaceful relations. The negotiations lasted most of the afternoon, conducted in a mixture of English and Shawnee, with Riverhawk often serving as translator when nuances needed clarification. The proposed treaty was comprehensive, addressing everything from hunting territories to trade protocols to systems for resolving conflicts. The most contentious issue involved land boundaries. Settlers wanted clear delineation of property they could fence and farm, while Shawnee concepts of land use focused on seasonal patterns and shared resources. Finding language that satisfied both worldviews required creativity and patience, with Riverhawk often suggesting phrasings that bridged the conceptual gap. One tense moment came when a Shawnee elder questioned whether any treaty with whites could be trusted, given the long history of broken promises. Bradford listened respectfully, then responded with unexpected humility. "You're right to doubt," he said, his voice heavy with acknowledgement of past wrongs. "My people have lied and stolen and broken faith more times than I can count. All I can promise is my own word and the commitment of those who came with me today." The honesty seemed to shift something in the room. The elder nodded slowly, appreciating the refusal to make grandiose promises that couldn't be kept. Other council members leaned forward with renewed engagement, willing to continue negotiating now that Bradford had demonstrated he understood the depth of Shawnee's skepticism. Riverhawk spoke up when the discussion turned to mechanisms for resolving disputes. She proposed a council of mediators drawn equally from both communities, people who had demonstrated commitment to peace and who could hear grievances and recommend solutions. The proposal was radical because it required each side to grant legitimacy to the other's representatives. After extensive discussion, both sides agreed to try the system. As the sun began setting, they had a treaty framework they could take back to their respective communities for final approval. It wasn't perfect, but it represented genuine progress toward coexistence based on mutual respect rather than domination. That evening brought unexpected news. A messenger arrived with word that Josiah Kimball had died, alone and unmourned, his final years marked by increasing isolation. The messenger brought a letter informing Riverhawk that she had been named in Josiah's will. She opened it with shaking hands, Black Wolf reading over her shoulder. Josiah had left her the small plot of land that had been her mother's dowry. Along with the deed was a letter, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. He wrote that he had been wrong, that his treatment of her had been inexcusable, that he understood why she had fled. He wrote that the land was his only way of saying what he couldn't say in life, that she had deserved better. Riverhawk read it 3 times, each reading bringing complicated emotions. This wasn't the clear-cut ending she had imagined. Instead, Josiah had become human in death, revealed as someone capable of growth and regret, even if that growth came too late to repair the damage he had done. "What will you do with the land?" Black Wolf asked quietly. Riverhawk folded the letter carefully. "I'll keep the deed, but not the land," she said slowly. "I'll donate it to Bradford's community with the stipulation that it be used for something that serves both settlers and Shawnee. A meeting house, perhaps? Or a school where children from both communities can learn together," Black Wolf smiled. "You take something born from pain and transform it into a tool for healing. This is who you are, Riverhawk." His words brought tears to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that her life had meaning, that her suffering hadn't been pointless, but had equipped her to do important work. The weeks that followed brought the treaty to final approval from both communities. The land that had been Josiah's final gift became the site of a building that would serve as neutral ground. Riverhawk participated in its construction, working alongside both Shawnee and settler women, her presence a living reminder of what was possible when people chose connection over division. Nuss. When her 3rd child arrived on the first day of spring, Riverhawk and Black Wolf named him Bridgewalker, a name that carried the weight of their hopes for the future. He would grow up in a world still struggling to overcome generations of conflict. But he would also grow up knowing that peace was possible. As Riverhawk held her newborn son and watched her daughters play nearby, while both Shawnee and settler women celebrated his birth together, she understood that her story had never really been about rescue. It had always been about recognition, about one person seeing another's humanity clearly enough to act on it, about the transformative power of choosing mercy over vengeance. The scars on her back would never fade completely, would remain as permanent testament to where she had come from. But they no longer defined her. She was Riverhawk, daughter of Bright Moon, wife of Black Wolf, mother of 3 children who embodied the future. She was bridge builder and treaty negotiator, healer and mediator, living proof that people could change. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were sleeping, she would sometimes stand at the river's edge and remember that terrified girl who had taken a warrior's hand 3 years before. She would thank that girl for her courage, for her willingness to step into the unknown, for her refusal to accept that the life she had known was all that life could be. The river flowed on, as it always had, carrying away the past while nourishing the present and flowing toward an unknown future. Riverhawk watched its constant movement and understood that she was like the river herself, shaped by where she had been but not trapped there, always moving forward, always carrying the possibility of renewal. Standing there with her hand on her heart and her face turned toward the future, Riverhawk knew with absolute certainty that every step of that journey had been worth it. She had found not just freedom but purpose, not just safety but love, not just acceptance but the power to shape the world into something better. And that, in the end, was the real story worth telling. Not about a victim who was saved, but about a survivor who chose to transform her pain into power, her suffering into strength, and her despair into hope that lit the way forward for everyone who came after. The girl who had been whipped every night had become the woman who built bridges between worlds, proving that where we come from matters less than who we choose to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.